Can Netflix conquer the gaming space the way it conquered streaming?
And is your iPhone really at risk from Pegasus spyware? Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. Hey there, welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News. Each week we sneak across the state borders to catch up with Australia's leading tech journalists and dive into the big tech news of the week. I'm Adam Turner, coming to you from the Democratic People's Republic of Melbourne, and I'm joined as usual by my co-host Alex Kidman, based deep in the kingdom of Sydney Stan. Alex, the thought of fleeing the planet sounds pretty good right now.
Pretty good.
This week saw Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos briefly touch the edges of space in a, let's just say, suggestively shaped rocket that, looked very Austin Powers. What do you reckon he was doing up there with his, what would you do with a few brief moments in space?
Look, pretty clearly, if you're Jeff Bezos, you're just flicking the V's at those Amazon warehouse workers. I mean, he does that on Earth, so I don't see why he'd change his habits just because he's in zero G. As for me, I think the answer is really, really obvious. What you must do if you've got a couple of minutes in space in zero G is call one of those places that promises to deliver a pizza in 30 minutes, because I'd like to see them try.
Nice. We're also joined this week by Age and Sydney Morning Herald tech editor Tim Biggs. Tim, if you had a brief moment in space, what would you do with it?
I would get some sleep, to be honest. I think a couple of minutes in orbit away from my children, I wouldn't even be able to have a choice, I think. I would just drift off in zero G and cushion myself against nothing. It'd be amazing.
Those are some fine priorities you got there.
Yeah, is it 2 under 3 or 2 under 5 in your house?
It is 2 under 5. Yeah, there's a 4-year-old and a 1.5-year-old.
How do you even know what sleep is, sir? I mean, really?
I remember. I have vivid memories of bliss.
So while we compare, horror stories and the joys of sleeping in space, it's another big week in tech news, everything from gaming to security. Tim's here to talk about Netflix's attempts to conquer the gaming world and Steam's latest hardware. But first, we're talking security. So there was only one man for the task. We put up the bat signal. We caught up with the one and only Stilgherrian to unpack Pegasus and its effect on smartphone security.
So I can recall the days when Pegasus referred to an email client, because I'm truly, truly ancient. But these days, however, if you mention Pegasus, you're probably talking about NSO's spyware application. We're joined by the one and only Stilgherrian. Still, what is Pegasus in this spyware context?
Well, guys, it is certainly not a very bad song about a man called Horse either, which shows my age. It is what in the cyber trade, called a RAT, a remote access tool or spyware. Basically, it's software which, if you get on someone's device, in this case mobile phones, you control it. You can read their email, read their messages, turn on the microphone, turn on the camera, do whatever you like. And if it's bad guys doing it, it's called malware. And if it's good guys doing it, it's called spyware. But it's basically the same idea. So what NSO Group has done, I mean, they're an Israeli company that makes this stuff, right? And it's founded by some folks who used to work for Unit 8200, which is the Israeli intelligence services signals intelligence group, like the NSA, like the Australian Signals Directorate and all of them. This is their tool. This is the one they sell to governments, they say, around the world. So what's been discovered or released this week is a list of phone numbers which some people are saying is a target list, and which NSO Group is saying that is definitely not a target list. How dare you? This is an outrage, sir. But it's 50,000 phone numbers of everyone from heads of state to journalists to political activists and so on. And a group has sampled some of them and found that of the 67 odd that they checked, they got in touch with people, and about half of them were, yep, you've got NSO Group's spyware, Pegasus, on it. Someone has been spying on you.
Now, these people actually have the nerve, the NSO have the nerve to say with a straight face that our customers promised us they'd only use it on the bad guys, right?
That's right. That's right. But, their customers have been known to include a wide range of people. Back in 2012, the government of Panama, one of the major, of course, security and global security governments in the world, bought 200 licenses to use this. And they ended up, of course, on the phones of people critical of the government. Because that idea of who's a criminal and who's a terrorist is, shall we say, one of those irregular words around the world,
Very much in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, oh, very much. And Toby Fegan, who's Australia's ambassador for cyber affairs, did say once that when they are making treaties and doing negotiations around the world, particularly he said in the East Asian region and the Southeast Asian region, you're going to be very careful about putting in, it's okay to go after terrorists, because I can happily say China and go, yeah, what they mean is dissidents, like the people in Xinjiang, etc., who, as far as the Chinese government is concerned, are terrorists. As far as the Australian government is concerned, no, they're just your citizens.
But I believe the phone list, not the 67 or so that they identified with this particular bit of spyware on it, I believe the phone list included people like the French president. Now, you might not agree with their politics, but terrorist? I mean, I think if you're the president of a country, you probably deserve a bigger title than terrorist if you're actually threatening in some way.
Well, yes, broadly speaking, the president of France is not a terrorist as far as, we understand. But then you've also got to look at the Australian Signals Directorate was caught in the phones of the wife of Indonesia's president. Now, broadly speaking, I don't think she's a terrorist either. And I think it was the NSA were found up in the phone of Angela Merkel, German Chancellor. Broadly speaking, she's not a terrorist either. So it's important to look at this in the context of, look, everyone spies on everyone else. That's a thing. But there is also this market. Look, they're arms dealers. It's, they're making weapons. In fact, the Israeli government considers these hacking tools to be weapons, and therefore there are export controls, and therefore they have to get government of approval for everyone they're selling this stuff to. But then when you sell stuff to governments, what does that government then do with it? That's the thing, isn't it? They've got, in the case of Panama, these 200 licenses for software, and NSO Group says, well, we don't know who they're using them on. We have no access to that. And I go, well, that's probably true. Convenient. Well, Apple says it doesn't have the content of your messages either. So, not that I'm saying Apple is a terrorist organization, probably. But, this is where it gets really shady. And just as an aside, can I give a really big plug to a book by a British comedian by the name of Mark Watson, and the book is called As Used on the Famous Nelson Mandela. And it's about the arms trade. And that title comes from an advertising strapline that he saw at an arms fair on these prisoner restraint devices. And they said, "Way, you should get these as used on the famous Nelson Mandela in South Africa."
I'll
it's a
that
very funny book.
Hmm.
You'll second that? Yeah, because he basically is an instruction book on how to set yourself up as an international arms dealer. And he does so with a group of teenage schoolgirls who set up an arms dealing firm, and then you get an Israeli arms company. Israel's coming up a lot in this. That's coincidence. But yes, the guy comes out to demonstrate this device for throwing rocks at protesters. And when he gets there, it's a bunch of schoolgirls as used on the famous Nelson Mandela.
So I think one of the things that's particularly scary about Pegasus, it's a zero-click exploit. Now, normally you think, okay, I'm all right because I didn't, click on that attachment, or I didn't return that call, or I didn't open that link. But what do we mean by zero-click? How easy is it to get infected?
Well, very. They just send you something on iMessage, but it doesn't show up on iMessage. It just infects your phone. You don't even know you've received a message. That's what they mean by zero click. Or they attach a photograph to an email to you or whatever, and for some reason the structure of that image will trigger the vulnerability in the photo app or whatever, and they're in. So they're combining what's called a zero-day vulnerability, i.e. one that has not yet officially been notified to, in this example, Apple, so called because when a vendor, Apple is a hardware manufacturer or a software manufacturer, when they're notified of a security vulnerability, it takes them a certain amount of time to confirm it and make a fix. And that's usually 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks, something like that. They've got to get it and test it and package it up and send it out like they did with the iOS update a few days ago. Problem is, what if you've never seen that before? On day zero, the first you know that this vulnerability exists is when it's out there in the wild and people are using it. So when these are discovered, the hackers who discover them have like a number of options. They can go through a process and tell the vendor and, thank you for your service. They can go to a vendor who has a bug bounty program. Like if you disclose it to them, they'll pay you money and say thank you very much. But for a zero-day vulnerability in iOS, Apple only pays out about $200,000. Now, on the black market, you can get $500,000 to $1 million for a good zero-day vulnerability in iOS. If it really does give you complete control of the phone and you don't have to click on anything, but that's $1 million in cash or Bitcoin equivalent on the black market. Or you could sell it to NSO Group, or you could sell it to NSO Group. I mean, that's how it works. So it is a shady business, but then so is the arms trade generally. Would you like to buy some landmines? I know a guy.
So we'll get back to the landmines later. But
yep, off air, yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Other podcasts, you have been warned. But Apple has a kind of an interesting position here, as I understand it, though, because they don't, to my understanding, tend to engage with the security community quite as much. They do have a bug bounty program, but they don't really tend to talk about stuff till it's fixed. They've come under some criticism, to my understanding, for being quite slow to fix some exploits. And I think some of the ones that Pegasus has highlighted have been around for a while, but obviously Apple wasn't treating them as seriously. Should Apple be doing more?
Yes, and I'm in print, as it were, in pixels, having said exactly that Apple lags a decade behind Microsoft, for example, in terms of dealing with the community. Now, Microsoft back in 2001-ish, I mean, its reputation was garbage, right? It had so many vulnerabilities up the wazoo that it became a joke. So Bill Gates actually sent out an all-staff memo at the time called, and the headline was subject line was trusted computing. And he basically said, look, if people don't trust our stuff, they're not going to buy it. We have a problem. We need to fix this. And they completely re-engineered how they produce software. And it took them years to kind of do that. But they caught up. Apple, on the other hand, had until quite recently, here is the exact word from Apple's security policy website: for the protection of our customers, Apple does not disclose, discuss, or confirm security issues until a full investigation has occurred and any necessary patches or releases are available. So there can be a security vulnerability in an Apple product for years because they will not discuss it with anyone until they've fixed it.
That's not concerning at all.
No. Now, I went to confirm that today. That was boilerplate text in every security patch, every security update for all of Apple's products up until about a year ago. So they've changed that line, but how much is this actually reflected in the way they engage with the public? I suspect that they changed that wording because they started to do their own bug bounty program. But certainly they're not spending as much money on it in terms of handing out the rewards to the people who are putting in the work.
Apple's contention, I suspect, would be, though, that in the smartphone space, they are more secure, or at least seem to be more secure than, for example, the Android equivalent. Just looking across kind of broader Madwell. Yeah.
But
is it better to come from a position of, well, we're basically locked down, but maybe a few rats can get in that hole in the side, than there are holes everywhere, but at least we tell you where the holes are?
I think Apple's approach is more, look, there are rats everywhere. We just won't let you see. We just won't show them to you. They're invisible rats. Look, who knows? I mean, it at one level you think, look, Apple's great. It's locked down. You don't have random app stores and side loading of apps and any of those things, which you do on Android. And there's a lot of open source stuff in the Android world, so you can see the code and blah, blah, blah. But I sometimes wonder whether open source code really is more secure because of the many eyes theory. People look at it and find the bugs. Come on, how much of that old code really does have people looking at it today?
Amnesty, who put out the report on Pegasus, along with a bunch of other media organizations, have also put out a checking tool so people can work out, hey, do I have Pegasus on my phone? But it relies on using the command line. My brain just says, yeah, look, 99.99999% of consumers are either not going to know how to do that, or they're just not going to do it because it sounds terrifying.
Well, it is, and certainly for iOS in the Apple world, to get a command line, you have to have all of the developer tools and set up a computer to do that. You can't just load up a command line app on your iPhone. It's not going to happen. And look, Dmitry Alperovich, who founded CrowdStrike, which Donald Trump seemed to believe was a Ukrainian organization, which is magical because Dmitry is originally Russian. But, whatever. He sounds a bit foreign, but he's, pretty much American. He kind of would like Apple to make that kind of forensic information easier to get at. But I thought, yeah, maybe for you, mate. I don't think, I'm reasonably technically proficient in this stuff, but I don't want to go faffing around down there. Just I want a tool. I want to just go, is this infected or not? Yes or no?
Yeah.
But then NSO Group will the very next day roll out a different version and your detection tool won't work.
Maybe the big scary question, because you said that because these are weapons, they need a license from the Israeli government to export it. Now, I assume they keep the good stuff for themselves.
Well, you would think so. Yeah, in the military world, there's always an export version of a weapon.
So there are scarier versions of this thing.
The export version of the F-16 doesn't have some of the nifty radars and other such things in it. It's got another one. But yeah, absolutely, there is going to be scarier stuff around that is not for sale.
But how scared, and I've seen this argument float around a bit as well, how scared should the average person be? I mean, technically we qualify as journalists. We might, want to be a little bit alarmed, although if the Israelis really want to look at my phone, I don't want them to, but yeah, they're probably going to. But for the average iPhone user, and iPhones are a huge part of the Australian smartphone marketplace, is this of genuine concern? I've seen some arguing, oh, look, all of this is of concern because it's a bug. I've seen others arguing, yeah, look, no, because it's not going to target you, which doesn't sit that well with me as thinking either.
Yeah, look, who is someone who might be under threat from a nation state actor? And if we put aside NSO Group and Israel and whatever, because, well, NSO is selling to everyone, but broadly at all of this stuff, well, pretty much every overseas student in Australia is, and particularly those from China, are kind of being watched by their government from afar. That becomes a thing. Anyone working in research that is considered either leading edge for the economy or basic military stuff. Anyone who works in the iron ore industry and the resources industry who might have information related to contracts with Chinese buyers. I'm picking on China again, don't want to pick on them. It's very good, handy to know the price that you might be prepared to go down to for selling 1 million tons of iron ore or sugarcane or wheat or COVID-19 vaccines. So, it's not about who you are as such. It can be about what information you might have access to, what information your partner might have access to. And when this stuff is getting cheaper and cheaper to use, and I mean, even if Panama is buying 300 licenses of this stuff, imagine how much a larger country might buy. They might buy 5,000 licenses of it. And as I say, that list of phone numbers, which has not been confirmed as a target list, which NSO denies it's a target list, but it did have 50,000 phone numbers on it.
That's a lot of software to sell. I guess we'll find out. Thanks so much for your time, Stilgherrian. But before
Pleasure,
you go,
guys.
You get to face the classic vertical hold 3 questions of doom, TM.
Uh-oh.
Where can people find your work online? Where can they find you on social media? And the controversial question, what's the best TV sitcom of all time?
Oh, wow. Okay. The first two, the answer is the same, but I'll give different answers. Stilgherrian is the name. I won't spell it. Have a go at spelling it. Google will sort you out. Stilgherrian.com and Stilgherrian on Twitter. The second one is my podcast, The 9 p.m. Edict, which you can find in all of the podcast places. It's a bit rude and a bit wrong. And the third one, greatest TV sitcom of all time, certainly of the last 20 years, is BoJack Horseman.
Oof.
Oh, now there's a new entry, but a great one.
A bit from left field. Yeah, solid choice.
Well, thanks for making time for the show for this week, Stil.
It's a pleasure, guys. Anytime.
So, describing things as the Netflix of is a bit of a cliche, but recently Netflix announced that it wants to become the Netflix of gaming by adding some game options to its existing streaming services. Tim, can Netflix do it? And what indeed, I suppose, from a starting point, what is Netflix saying they're going to do precisely?
Yeah, so I mean, details are pretty thin at the moment. I think most of what we're going off are comments from some of the executives during an earnings call. But it seems like what they want to do is start inserting video games into their existing offering. So it wouldn't be the case that they're publishing games on a platform or they're sort of having an additional thing. They want your existing Netflix subscription to also include video games. And they're talking about, it taking years of sort of experimentation for them to get it right. They're talking about different kinds of genres, different partnerships, different kinds of delivery mechanisms. So I feel like, this is a thing where we're going to see it take various forms. I don't think you're going to log into Netflix and have a heading that says games. I think they're going to be doing, interactive storytelling like they've already dabbled in. I think they're going to be doing streaming content like you get from Stadia or, Microsoft. I think they're going to be partnering with existing game studios, and they're focusing on mobile to begin with, which also makes me think that they're going to be installing stuff locally on your machine. So it seems like they're kind of just planting their flag, and then they're going to work out, what's the best way to deliver it later.
Is this the service that nobody asked for?
Yeah, well, I don't think anyone did ask for it,
No.
But in terms of what they've said so far, I think they're saying the right things, because there is a gap in the market, definitely, where on phones, you look at the most successful games, and they're all free to play, or they're all involving gambling, or gacha mechanics. And then if you look at games that have something to do with movie or TV IP, they're also bad because they're just used as a promotional vehicle. So if you've got someone like a Netflix, and it's the same with Apple and Arcade or Xbox and Game Pass, if you've got a situation where someone's already paying you the subscription, then you have to make sure that the games are at a high enough quality to retain people and attract new people. You're not worrying about whether you can get them to pay more money. So I think in that sense, it could actually work out that there's some good quality stuff there. And if there isn't, you're not paying any extra anyway. So I don't really see it as a negative.
See, mobile, though, is tricky because, you've already mentioned Apple Arcade. You've also got, like, Google Play Pass, for example, as well. So you've got established players in what people would think of as that subscription space, pay as a price, get access to games. But you've also got to try and appeal to the majority of people. And while they could probably do what they like on Android, Apple's an entirely different story. I would not be shocked if Apple simply said, no, Netflix, you can have a client on iOS and iPadOS and so on for streaming video. But if you want a games thing, that's separate, and we want 30% of that as well.
I hardly think Apple will take any exception to people running their own game store on iOS. It seems like a perfectly legitimate competition that they would welcome.
With open arms.
Right, so Tim's just delivered you the big sack of cash then, Tim?
Yes.
Tim Cook, that is. But no, I do think that's going to be a tough nut for them to crack. And you mentioned the kind of movie tie-in thing, and I think that's tough for Netflix too, because while Netflix has a lot of those big hit streaming shows and that's been a big part of its success, it doesn't actually own an awful lot of them. If you look at the ones that actually have had, for example, DVD releases or that have bounced in from elsewhere, you get a lot of stuff that's labeled as a Netflix series, but basically Netflix has just paid for the distribution. They don't own the IP, which means it could be a lot tougher to produce, for example, a Tiger King game than you might think.
You can look at the games they've already produced, and there's been a few of them. There's been a Stranger Things game. There's been a Dark Crystal. Is that what it's called? Dark Crystal?
Yeah, Age of Resistance, yeah.
There's been a game related to that as well, and they've been sort of fine as games in terms of their quality. But I think maybe that's one part of the strategy that they'll use. There's a new series of Stranger Things coming out, and here's your companion game. And on the other hand, I think they'll look to either do completely original games the same way that they would produce an original series like Stranger Things, or they'll look to make deals either with people who own IP the same way they do with distribution rights, or with people who make games, like get in a Way Forward or even like a Ubisoft or someone to create something. So I think they're probably going to, do whatever they can. I don't think it'll be one, specific strategy.
They're going to need some flagship titles because, like all game stores, 90% of it's going to be crap. We all know that. But they're going to have some flagship titles. And I would think the best way to do that is to get the top game studios on board and pay them a shed load of money for exclusives that you can only play on the Netflix platform. Does that sound like the way you think they'd approach it?
Well, I don't think there's any reason why they couldn't do it the same way that they do it with TV and movies. They've got a mix. There's production houses and directors and actors that you recognize on Netflix. It's not all things that they've incubated themselves.
Yeah.
And I don't see any reason why they wouldn't do that. Like, it's probably not going to be them going to, EA and getting them to make a game for them, because I don't think they're going to drop that kind of money. But there's no reason they wouldn't go to a Square, and even if it gets some traction, say, why don't you make a game for us that ties in with your existing properties, and sort of everybody gets something out of that.
We've already got a model, it strikes me, though, for how this kind of bundling thing is done, because Amazon do it. So if you're an Amazon Prime subscriber, you're probably aware that you get the shipping. You might be aware that you get, limited music and really, really limited books. But you're probably not aware that you also get gaming, and that includes a bunch of free games. Historically, they've done mobile. Currently, it's much more on the PC side of things. But it's almost an afterthought in the Amazon universe. I'm kind of concerned that might be the case with Netflix as well.
Yeah, well, I think it's going to be years before we really know. I think they'll probably continue along the path that they're currently on, like with those games they've already released and the interactive streaming videos that they've had on certain platforms, like Bandersnatch. I think you'll see more things like that sort of dotted throughout. And who knows, the technology might get to a point where the games are available on smart TVs as well, or they're integrated with series and movies. Who knows whether they'll find that spark of something that gives them a place in the ecosystem that nobody else has.
Well, speaking of things that we will be waiting several years to see, Valve also announced some new hardware recently that we will apparently be waiting several years, possibly even more, to see down under. The Steam Deck, which, as a title, doesn't instill confidence in
No.
me. Tim, what's a Steam Deck?
Like
It's
an
such
upper
a
decker?
bad name. There's already something called the Stream Deck, and my brain
Yeah.
just keeps going to Stream Deck, and I can't help it. Steam Deck, and Deck doesn't make any sense related to Steam. I don't know. It's a bad name, but essentially what it is it's a PC that's been forced into a smallish. I guess it maybe looks like a skateboard. Maybe that's what they were going for. It's been squished into a small machine that you can play handheld. So the easiest way to explain it, at least from a visual point of view, is it's like a Nintendo Switch, but for PC. It looks like a Switch because it's that basic shape. It's got controls on the side. It's got a big touchscreen in the middle, but it's a PC that plays games. So as you already alluded to, Alex, it looks like it's going to be a ways out. They opened pre-orders in America and a few other places, but it looks like even there, most people aren't going to get theirs until the middle of next year. They haven't opened any kind of availability for Australia. But to be honest, I think it looks great, and I'm an unashamedly big fan of portable gaming. But for this specifically, you're paying Australian dollars 550 at the low end, 800 and something at the high end, and you're getting the equivalent of a pretty nice gaming PC, which would cost you more if you're buying it, as a desktop thing. And it's got all the openness of a PC ecosystem. You can install what you want on it. You can plug it into a monitor if you want. You can plug it into any gaming pad or keyboard and mouse. And the most important thing for me, at least, is it gives me access to that vast Steam library in a format that I would actually use, because I never use it on a PC. I don't want to sit down at a desk. I'm not that kind of person. But the ecosystem is hard to argue with. It's so full of games that I would love to have, a bit more portably.
When you say something like that, I'm going to argue with it, right?
Yeah.
No, sorry. I mean, I'm intrigued by it. I'm very keen to kind of get hands on and see what it can really do. But I'm also seeing a whole bunch of limitations here, not least of which is that price. You're not wrong. In hardware terms, it's a reasonable sort of deal at the high end. That low end machine, the one that's roughly around $550, it'll be 600 plus because those are US prices. Well, I presume you're converting off the US price and there's no sales tax on that. So 600 plus. That only gets you 64 gig of onboard storage, which is any PC gamer will tell you is nowhere near enough. Nowhere near enough.
You wouldn't get Call of Duty on that.
Yeah. And it's on an eMMC, so it's actually on a slower memory storage format too. It's only the higher end ones that get an SSD. And the comparison to the Switch concerns me because, the two are broadly similar and obviously they're targeting similar sorts of markets. People program specifically for the Switch. Almost nobody is going to build a game specifically for the Steam Deck. They're just going to build a PC game as you would. But that doesn't mean, as any Steam user could tell you, that everything will run smoothly. You're going to hit weirdness, especially because this is, while you can install Windows on it, this is running SteamOS, Valve's weird Linux variant thing, which is great for game display. Don't get me wrong. It's great for game discovery and stuff like that. But it means if you're actually running a Steam game, which is Windows, it's an emulation layer, and then there's all the things that can go wrong with a PC game over time and patches and all that kind of stuff. I can totally see some people going nuts for this, but I think for a lot of people, it might be a bit of an expensive headache, especially if it starts to break down, because it's almost like the Switch Lite. Those joysticks are hardwired into my understanding, although the spec does keep changing a bit as time goes on.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely. It's not one of those things that I think is going to take off immediately in a mainstream way. It's definitely going to be for, tinkerers and enthusiasts. And you're right, that low end, I feel like they included purely so that they're going to have something at that price point, because the storage is not up to snuff, even in size or in technology. There's an SD card there, but I mean, SD cards are expensive and they're not as fast as the, NVMe that you're getting on the higher end things. But, I think in terms of the performance and the compatibility, I believe that Valve will put in the effort to at least make sure that, things that run on their Linux distribution are going to run fine. I think their layer that you're talking about, it is sort of hit and miss. There's definitely going to be the case that you're going to have compatible games and you're going to have shrug, like maybe like the way that you have now if you're trying to use like a controller or something, and the game's like, these definitely work, and then they're just like, I don't know, like try it and see. That's definitely going to happen. But I think it's only going to improve over time, and I think there's a lot more room for error with something like this, because if you were talking about this as a desktop PC where people are targeting 1440p 4K, within a year no games are going to run on it. But with a machine like this that's targeting 720p on that screen, I think it's going to be so much more performant than an equivalent desktop gaming rig, and we're going to be pleasantly surprised by how much stuff just brute force runs on it. Is it going to run at the highest settings? No. Is it going to have support for all the bits and bobs that the latest video cards are putting out? No. But is it going to allow me to play most of my Steam library on the couch? I think it probably is, and I think it probably will for a few years.
So is this Valve just looking at the Switch and saying, we need a slice of this?
I don't know if it would be like, I don't think it's a thing that like the Switch is a new category in like the PC space, because obviously we've got gaming laptops and we've had them for a long time. I don't think it's like a
but you can't compare the Switch to a gaming laptop, though. It is a totally different experience.
Really compare the Switch to this as well. I think they look similar visually, but I think this is going to end up being a lot more like a PC than it is like a Switch. Not only because you can install everything on it, and if you wanted, you could just plug it into a desktop and do work on it. But I think Alex is right that it is never going to be a situation where you open up a store like you do on a Switch, you see the games you want, and they all run. I think it's going to be a lot more like using Steam is, where things are a bit weird, things are a bit clunky, and I think Valve knows that. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Switch and the popularity of the Switch and the fact that so many indie games do so well on Switch because it's portable, I wouldn't be surprised if Valve saw that and thought, well, why wouldn't that be true for us as well? Why wouldn't these sort of smaller scale experiences do better on a machine that's a lot more portable than the average gaming PC?
Hardware's a puzzle, though, that Valve's been trying to solve for a long, long while, and its past history is not good. When you had the Steam machines, and they were, frankly, a screaming disaster. The Steam Link was sort of okay, but only because it was cheap, and, probably the less said about the Steam controller, the better.
I mean, I feel like it's got better over time, though. When we start with Steam machines and end with the Index, I feel like there's an upward, trajectory.
You can't keep failing all the time?
Exactly. Yeah. Every now and again, you're going to make something that, seems good, at least for the first couple of months, until, who knows what the Index is going to be like in the future. But I think there is some weirdness for sure. Like, I still don't exactly get how those thumb pads work on the Steam Deck. And apparently you can use them they like sense when your fingers are resting on the thumbsticks as well, so you can sort of do the same thing you do on index, where you like take your hands off to activate like motion controls and put them on, and it turns it off. No one's going to know how it feels until you actually use it and see whether it's a useful advancement of the ecosystem or not.
So I've sort of lost track of the wider ecosystem here. Do we still have something like a PlayStation Portable? Is there an equivalent to this? I don't think Xbox has ever done anything in this portable sort of space, have they?
There's only Switch at the moment. PlayStation gave up on their portables with the Vita. And I mean, Switch is the only one working at scale at the moment, and Nintendo's been the only one working at scale and portable for a very long time. So I don't think this is going to be going up against it. I think the person who is going to buy a Steam Deck, the Venn diagram doesn't have a whole lot of crossover with the person who's going to buy a Switch. But there's certainly
I suspect
lessons,
the person buying the Steam Deck already has a Switch. Let's face it. If you're dropping $900 on this, the couple of hundred you got to spend on a Switch is chump change, really. The openness of the PC platform is one of the things that gives the Steam Deck its value, but I guess it's a bit of a double-edged sword as well, because we won't see these till at least next year, and I think optimistically that might stretch into the year past. By which point, of course, the hardware in them will have moved on a little bit. And if this was a desktop, you mentioned, you couldn't quite buy a gaming desktop for the same price. You could upgrade those components. You could make changes to it. That's not really going to be the story here, though, is it?
No. So I think the storage is technically upgradable, but I don't think they're really selling it as that. I think they're selling it as a closed system. Everything's going to be soldered down. There'll be no upgrading of it. So what we're going to get, I assume, unless they come up with some sort of revision, what we're going to get in a year or two is going to be, the AMD Zen 2 architecture. It's going to be 16 gigabytes of RAM. It's going to be an NVMe SSD. And so you're right that when we compare it against what you can get for $800 in a desktop PC in a year and a half from now, there might be quite a big gap there. But again, I think the fact that it's targeting a 720p resolution is going to mean that it can hold its own against those machines, as long as you don't expect that you're going to be able to plug it into a 4K monitor and play your new games at 4K. As long as you sort of want it specifically for that handheld experience, I think it's probably still going to shape up. But the longer it takes to get here, obviously, the less impressive it's going to look by the time it arrives.
If I can't play 4K bubble on it, no sale. Well, that static sound can only mean that the kettle is boiled, or that it's time to wrap up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Tim for joining us for this week's show.
Thanks, folks.
And Tim, now it's time for you to take the classic Vertical Hold 3-question quiz. Where can people find your work online? Where can they find your social media online? And, of course, the big contentious question, which sitcom is the all-time greatest?
You can find my work at the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age on the websites and in the paper, if you still buy those things. You can find me on social media, on Twitter at Tim Biggs. And I think Seinfeld's probably the greatest. I mean, it's probably underrated at this point because it's just so ubiquitous. People just say, oh yeah, Seinfeld, but it's the greatest.
Solid choice.
I would solidly disagree with that, but what taste is
There's
all about.
There's a podcast in itself.
There is indeed. But while we debate the merits of that podcast, you can catch us online at Vertical Hold AU on Twitter, on the web at verticalhold.com.au, or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
And as always, thanks everyone for dropping by. We know it's tough at the moment, so hang in there. We hope you enjoy the show. Tell your friends about us. Leave us a review on your podcasting platform of choice and help us spread the good word in 2021. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.
Oh, what have been some of the others?
You've had your usual suspects. We've had a vote for Seinfeld.
Oh, tedious show. Nah. Garbage program.
Thank you.
Garbage
Thank
program.
you. Although, Adam, we're going to have to cut this bit out because that's the end of this show.
Oh, you're right. In the future, in a bit of the podcast that no one's heard yet.
You were going to listen to it in 20 minutes.